Alright, let's talk about Arc Raiders weapon DPS rankings. So the image on the left is the result of all of my hand DPS testing for every single weapon in Arc Raiders. I recently did a video where I went through the 5 starter weapons in the game, and I figured that based on that and the reaction to that video, I'm just going to go ahead and do all of them in one single go, because it seems like, you know, we're a little bit past the launch. There's a bunch of people that have done some very basic testing on DPS and throughput, but I wanted to lean in a little bit more into my background and kind of go into some more detailed, in-depth, a little bit more qualified DPS testing for these weapons in general, and we'll walk through that today. And I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to attach this image down below in the comments and the description, so you can check it out if you like to. This has all of the weapons in the game tested and ranked together, and yes, we did all of these, including weapon mods, as well as the 4 different upgrade values for each of the weapons here. So it's a lot of stats, a lot of detail, a lot of information, so if you want to look at this on your own, it'll be linked down below. Now, in general, these kind of videos always take a ton of work, so if you feel inclined to, or you got value out of this video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm as well, or don't. I'm not your dad. You can do whatever the heck you want. If you're wondering how I arrived at this, I ended up bringing up every single one of the weapons at all different upgrade levels into the practice range, and then did frame-by-frame analysis on the timings, reloads, and reactions, and also when there was actually breakpoints. Generally, when we're talking about weapons or any kind of game mechanic inside of a game, there's usually a mechanical aspect to it, and then there's a flourish, a art representation of it, animations, visual effects, things like that. However, there are easy ways to kind of break through these. There's pre-fire and post-fire times in the animations, and also win ammo reloads and things like that. I'm not including like perfect, like frame perfect animation canceling for these weapons in general. There are ways to make a few of the weapons a lot more effective, especially like the Hole Cracker or the Renegade, for example, if you do swapping mechanics even after the hotfix that we got yesterday. But in general, went through and kind of checked all of these, mainly because a lot of the stats that you see on the actual in-game tooltips are wrong. They're not represented properly, or they're not the whole deal. They don't even show the whole detail there. So what I did is I took a live split speedrun timer, put it on screen, went through all of the weapons, tested all their breakpoints and how they function, and also just looked at that frame by frame on super slow motion to see exactly when those weapons were functioning, what was breaking, what was working, and that's how we ended up at this result here. We're also going to be splitting the weapons up based on their breakpoints for causing reload, as well as the accuracy that they have, because those two things are super important. If you can eliminate another player without incurring the reload penalty in Arc Raiders, that is a massive difference and something to pay attention to, so that's going to be weighed heavily in this as well. A couple disclaimers before we dive in. The answer to this question always comes up, and I know some people don't like ranking or tier lists or whatever, and they think YouTubers are the plague of the earth, but in general, my recommendation is always the best weapon for you in any game is always going to be the weapon that you can succeed with. For some people, those are weapons that might be lower down on the DPS throughput totem pole just because of the way it functions, the way it feels. The weapon that is best for you is the weapon that you can land your shots with consistently, and if, you know, don't be discouraged by trying to force yourself to pick something that has a higher DPS throughput that you miss more often with, because that will end up lowering your overall TTK against other players. Truly, this is just a reference point for you to make that decision as well, and I think it's also important that you're honest with yourself about the accuracy that you have in game, because triggering reloads due to inaccuracy is a massive penalty in Arc Raiders. In fact, most of the reload times in Arc Raiders are much larger than most FPS games. Reloading is one of the most expensive things that you can do in a head-to-head fight in Arc Raiders, just because the reload times, I mean, typically in shooter games, if they're like, you know, more fast-paced shooter games, reloads can be half a second to a second and a half. In like tactical shooter games, reloads can be like 1 second to 2 to 2.5 seconds. However, the reload times in Arc Raiders are like 3 seconds to 8 seconds. It is egregiously long comparatively to most other shooters, FPS or TPS, and so you really need to be kind of comfortable with the fact that if you are triggering reloads, that is going to be the biggest contributing factor to you losing a fight in a lot of cases. And there are weapons that are better with low accuracy and higher reload count, and there are weapons that are worse with that, so being honest with yourself is super important. And it's also worth noting that Arc Raiders is a third-person game, which means not every fight is a pure DPS race, so even though there are some weapons that have lower DPS throughput compared to other weapons, If you're hiding behind cover and only firing when the weapon is ready to fire, that can change the efficacy of that weapon dramatically, where it may lose in a straight up head-to-head fight when you're just trading shots at each other. But if you can get the jump on someone or use cover and peek only when you're available, certain weapons start to climb up a little bit more. Then onto this, just so people understand what's going on here, I just wanted to point this out. This is split into 4 different categories, and this is based on how accurate you are with your shots, right? So I have this separated out, and the reason this is important again is because some people, it's good to understand that if you're not going to be, on the higher end of accuracy, right? Like someone who puts a lot of time and effort into being competitive in first person and third person shooters, then it's going to be a big difference. Like there's breakpoints in here where some weapons become more effective versus less effective depending on how accurate you are. You'll notice that on the far right side, if you're godly aim, like, the umpteenth percent, the highly accurate competitive players, you'll notice in this first row here, there is no Il Toro. It doesn't even make it onto the first screen. It's going to be lower down here on the list, mainly because the Il Toro is exceptional at dealing damage, but it actually deals its damage quite slowly compared to other weapons, unless you don't have high accuracy with the other weapons as well. So you notice if you have godly aim, the Il Toro falls off pretty hard, but towards the very bottom, if you have below average aim, things like the Anvil or the Il Toro work really, really well, because if you can land a shot, it's so heavily loaded in damage on that single hit that allows you to do effective damage anyways, even though you have lower aim. Then I have below average aim with weapon mods here. This shows you the difference between these TTKs based on having weapon mods on the weapon, and for some of these weapons it actually makes a massive difference and it's worth comparing. Then we have average aim. It means that you're not on below average, but you're not godly. You play shooter games regularly. You're not the best in the world, but you do try your best to hit as many shots as possible, and you believe that you're relatively consistent with those, and that will change the weightings and breakpoints for these weapons as well. You'll also notice that there is a comparison for unshielded, light shield, medium shield, and heavy shield, and those are going to be separated out. There are breakpoints for those as well. The way shields work in Arc Raiders, if you didn't know this, is it will deal, when you take damage, it deals damage to your HP and the shield simultaneously. The shield will feel full value on that damage, and then that damage reduction that's shown on the shield is how much damage you receive on your HP. And then when the shield value, the charge runs out, the shield breaks, you lose the damage reduction, and then you get full damage on your HP as well. So for some of these, you'll notice that there is actually an increase in the TTK based on the shield. You might notice in some of these as well, the time is actually very similar, and in some cases is really, really close together, depending on how accurate you are. So let's dive into this. So if you have below average aim, it means that you're probably you are definitely under the 50% accuracy margin. I would say that a lot of players do fall into this, but most probably don't. And I think it's something that's worth recognizing, and you don't necessarily need to be, especially in Arc Raiders, which is a third-person shooter game, which means you can take your time. It's also a non-battle royale, which means you can go anywhere you want. The extractions do close, but you can kind of play the map as much as you want, and you have plenty of time too. 30 minutes is a pretty long round time, assuming that you don't get a late spawn, and so you have options to play around how you want to engage with other players in general. So if you are in the camp of below average aim, I would say that you would probably want to, your best kit is probably going to be a Torrente and an Il Toro. Those have very, very low penalties for reloads because of how effective they are just for damage input. And also they have, very high throughput, even if you have bad accuracy, because as long as you land a single hit or two, you can do some pretty serious damage with those. Whereas if you're using an automatic weapon or even some of the semi-auto weapons, if you miss more than you hit, it is incredibly painful with how often you need to reload and how little damage you do for the shots you actually do land. So Il Toro is actually one of the best options you can use if you feel like your aim is quite low. The Anvil is up there as well, and you'll notice that as your accuracy gets better, the Anvil starts falling down more and more and more, and this is because even with the Anvil 4, the fire rate on the Anvil is so incredibly slow that getting that second shot, the time it takes for you to get that second shot, could mean that you're getting knocked down in that process while you're waiting for it. So the Anvil kind of falls into that semi-auto, getting pot shots from across the map or at maximum range, or trying to get, break shields ahead of time before you go into the full engagement. But in general, I would say it's probably not as useful for, straight DPS races, especially if you end up facing a player that has really high accuracy. They're going to blow you away with some of the more high DPS throughput weapons. Another weapon that pleasantly surprised me is the Arpeggio. For the longest time, I believe that the Arpeggio was one of the worst weapons in the game, and actually anything below Arpeggio 4 is actually pretty terrible. So if you are still still looking at the arpeggio, I would say in general it is quite bad. However, what surprised me the most was the breakpoints that it hits when it hits arpeggio 4, especially with weapon mods. Now, it is a burst fire weapon, and the spread and the bloom on that burst is actually incredibly high. So for most players, it might be kind of hard to make sure you land those shots with the arpeggio. But if you, I mean, look at this in general, you can see the arpeggio 4, ouch, like the arpeggio 3 isn't even listed on here until way down here on average aim. Like, look at the difference between arpeggio 3 all the way up to arpeggio 4. Like the arpeggio 4, because it has such a high fire rate increase, and in general, fire rate is its biggest, critical path. The biggest limiting factor for the arpeggio is the fire rate. So with an arpeggio 4 and weapon mods, maxed out to help reduce the wild inaccuracies that it has, as well as the magazine size to make sure you're able to fire more, is actually incredibly competitive. And you can see it's actually pretty close here, even in some cases slightly higher than the Venator, kind of popping that up if you can actually land those shots. Granted, it is a bit of an odd weapon, and that burst fire is quite unique. I think the Aphelion and the Arpeggio are very much acquired taste for a lot of people, but it's nice to see that the Arpeggio 4, if you fully max it out and put mods on it, it is worth using, and it is incredibly powerful if you can get used to the way it fires. Another takeaway from this is that the Berletta in general, statistics-wise, I would say is definitely underperforming. In my opinion, the Berletta, as you can see all the way down here, Berletta 4 is way down on the list. That's actually for a few reasons. I would say that the Berletta, while still being decently effective if you can land the shots, in my opinion, stats-wise, it ends up being a higher rarity version of the Kettle with worse stats across the board. It has a slower fire rate, but has the same damage per shot as the Kettle for some reason. And really, the only thing that has over the Kettle as a starter weapon versus a green rarity weapon in general is that it just has a faster reload. So it's like, it's a better weapon if you miss a lot more and have to reload more, but DPS throughput-wise, it's significantly worse. And I think that the Berletta could either lean more into that by giving it a higher base magazine size to break that out, just to make sure it's obviously not as strong as some of even the uncommon, the gray quality weapons or gray rarity weapons, but it is something that could be used if you're someone that just wants a trusty dusty sidearm that you can bring out that's not going to be reloading as much. So I would say that the Berletta is definitely underperforming for what it could be. It wouldn't be too hard to bring it in line and bring it up with some of these other weapons, but in general, I do not like seeing a Berletta 4, losing out to things like a Rattler 2, or even like a Venator 1 or something like that. It's still falling down pretty hard just because of the core stats that it has. I also want to highlight just how close a lot of these weapons are if you have exceptional accuracy. So you'll notice that the Renegade 4, Arpeggio 4, Volcano 4, and the Venator 4 are all like right around the exact same throughput if you have exceptional aim. Like if you are, most people aren't in this category, but if you have very good aim, all of these are very, very similar. It's kind of surprising that a single shot like discrete fire weapon like the Renegade is still up here, but again, if you can hit your shots, it's incredibly powerful. Then we have the Torrente, the Tempest, the Bobcat, all kind of very similar together. And now, since the nerfs, you can see that the Venator 4 is still slightly higher than that, but you'll notice that the Venator 3 is way down here. So Venator's power right now is almost entirely in its upgrades. You can see that like Venator 4 here at the very top of the godly aim list, but if we go down here, we have Venator 3, we keep scrolling, Venator 2, we keep scrolling, right? And then Venator 1, we've got these all the way down here. And so you really, right here, you really need to be paying attention to what weapons have very important upgrades or weapon mod breakpoints, where if you're not using them as they're upgraded, they can end up falling down under other weapons just because their upgrades are so crucial for what they do. And in my opinion, those weapons are the Renegade all the way up to 4, the Arpeggio all the way up to 4. I would not really use the Rattler under level 3 unless you do a free kit and you get it as part of that. Same thing for the Stitcher, and same thing for the Volcano. The Volcano actually gets some really nice upgrades, so I would say Volcano is better at 3 or 4 than it is at 1 or 2. In fact, I would say if you're going to use a Volcano 1 or 2, you might actually be better off using an Il Toro rather than the Volcano base level, just because the upgrades are so incredibly powerful. And the same thing for the Venator. I know the Venator is like the creme de la creme, super popular, everyone's touting it, everyone uses a Venator in general. However, based on the recent nerfs that it got, I actually would recommend using other weapons over the Venator if it's only at Venator 1 or 2, and I would also highly encourage you to only use a Venator unless you're just doing it for vibes and you feel like you're super comfortable with it. I would try to always upgrade your Venators all the way to level 4 because they actually have some pretty disparate changes between each upgrade. In fact, coming back here, if we go to like the average aim, like this is where a lot of people will probably fall into this category. If you look at the rankings here, you'll notice that the Venator IV, even just with average aim, is towards the top of the list. It's one of the best weapons that you can use in general. But if we go down to the Venator III, the Venator III is now already losing out to the El Toro 2, all of the Torrentes, even Volcano 2, Tempest 1 is beating out the Venator 3. Then we keep scrolling and you can see the Venator goes down. It's one of the weapons that has one of the biggest, this and the Arpeggio change a lot with every single upgrade. And so if we go all the way down here to find the Venator 1, you'll notice how many things are actually better at throughput here than the Venator 1, even a Bettina, an Anvil, a Rattler 3 or 4, Arpeggio, Bettina 3, 4, like all of these end up beating it out. So keep in mind that some of these weapons are, in my opinion, you really only want to use them when they're upgraded, and especially if they have weapon mods, if you have them available, as they do actually have a pretty massive difference in some of those. And you'll notice that some of these weapons almost never change with their upgrades. Like Torrente is pretty much the same always, just because it has such a large magazine size and very good damage throughput that in most situations, the upgrade is not going to matter much at all. You do get a little bit more magazine size and things like that, but just because it's so large already, most of the time the Torrente and the Tempest, whether you're level 1 or level 4, will be very similar in throughput if you have decent aim. That does change a little bit for some of these all the way over here. You can see the Tempest changes a little bit slightly and breaks apart, but in general, some weapons are pretty similar whether they're upgraded or not, and some weapons are night and day difference if they're upgraded. Another thing I want to point out is weapons like the Bobcat. The Bobcat, if we go all the way towards the lower end, you'll notice that the Bobcat actually loses out to a lot of weapons. So this is the Bobcat 4 here with low accuracy. You can see that if you have low accuracy in general, even things like Arpeggio 2, Stitcher 2, even the Bettina, even a Kettle 1 is better. So some weapons, partially because the Bobcat has such a high fire rate with a low magazine size, you'll notice that if you have excellent aim, things like the Bobcat are insanely strong, like up there with the best of them. Very, very powerful, very, very reliable. But if you start going down in accuracy and you start incurring more reload penalties with the Bobcat, it starts falling down really hard towards the bottom here. So I know you might be encouraged, or you might be very excited. You might, some people might say the Bobcat's one of the best weapons in the game, and maybe you pick up the Bobcat and try it and you're not super impressed. Partially that might be because you're just not hitting the same requirement of accuracy shots that you have with this in general. Another thing worth mentioning is all of the legendary weapons. They definitely take some time to farm to get them all working. However, in general, the legendary weapons don't beat any of the normal use weapons, and 2 of them are very specifically focused on one purpose. Like the Jupiter is very obviously going to be a PvE weapon. So you can see Jupiter down here with Hullcracker, Pharaoh, and Hairpin. Not really that great for using against other players in general. It's primarily used for destroying, Arc and dealing damage to Arc in general, just like the other few there. You do get some decent value out of the Aphelion depending on your accuracy. It is another burst fire weapon. So you see like the Aphelion kind of down here on the low accuracy plus weapon mods. You can see it jump up a little bit in some of these, like it's going up a little bit more as you get more accuracy on this as well. So you can kind of rely on that there, but then it falls a little bit more to some of the others. So the Aphelion is not really a weapon. Like it's decent, but given its value, difficulty in farming, and difficulty in acquiring magazines for it as well, it's definitely not something like you're going to be, in most cases, you'll be better off just using like a Kettle or a Stitcher or something over that in general, just because it is quite reliable relative to that. And you'll see that even the Equalizer is about middle of the road. It's not super exceptional. It's not beating out a lot of these other weapons, but it can be used quite reliably. I would say in general, the Equalizer feels like a more of a PvP option if you want to use it relative to other weapons. Even with average accuracy, you can see the Equalizer's a few places above the Aphelion in general, but again, it's still going to be losing to some of these other more reliable weapons. So there you have it. I don't want to go through every single line item. I don't think this needs to be like a 3-hour video in general. If you wanted to draw your own conclusions on how these weapons work, and also just let me know what weapons you're using, what you're most comfortable with, and which ones kind of fit for you in general in the game of Arc Raiders. But this one took a ton of work, doing a lot of hand testing. So if you like the video, leave a like or leave a comment down below, do your sort of thing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.